And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network at coalitionradionetwork.com, facebook.com/the Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at coalitionradio.us, and of course the mothership at coalitionradio.us. So again, we continue our special emphasis today on a Thursday on civil rights. Someone who is now officially qualified as repeat offender status is, of course, Hannah Cox. She is joining us with ConservativesConcerned.org. Conservatives concerned about the death penalty. In a week that has been, to say, tumultuous at best, 2 federal prisoners have been executed this week at the hands of your United States government. In a breaking of a trust, if you will, that existed for nearly a generation, the Trump administration and the Department of Justice has seen fit to take the lives of 2 individuals who, while adjudicated guilty by our quote-unquote jurisprudence system, I believe failed to meet the requirement necessary to be executed. And what do I mean by that? Well, there is no requirement. As a libertarian, I sincerely believe, it is at my DNA, that government simply does not possess the rights, nearly on a moral, a philosophical, or even a practical basis, to take the lives of another. And on a personal basis, a little editorialization by me, not my guest, but I've always found it astonishing that advocates of small government would cede to a federal government or a state government the ultimate denial of human rights. So Hannah Cox is joining us. She is the national manager. She is taking time from a hectic schedule, particularly with the events of this week. As national manager, she literally traverses, as some would say, the fruited plain, going from state house to advocate, to provide common sense, to preach to, if you will, the sanctity of life and government's failures and their consistent approach to executions. Hannah, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us again.
Thanks for having me back, Pat. Good to be here.
Well, let's first off, we always like to introduce the organization because folks who may not be familiar, despite your incredible efforts, those few folks who might not be familiar, I think we like to flesh out Conservatives Concerned. What was its, if you will, reason for organizing? What events precipitated folks coming together? And who are some of your supporters?
So Conservatives Concerned was founded in Montana. It was formed by a group of activists who were conservatives that were working around the legislature there, and their General Assembly was considering a bill at the time that would shorten the appellate process for the death penalty, which we often see states bring up similar legislation to that. And this group really felt strongly that that conservative values didn't line up with the death penalty, and that this was something conservatives should be against and should be working against. And so they sort of loosely started calling themselves Conservatives Concerned about the death penalty. They started talking to other Republicans. And what they found was that there were actually a lot of people who shared their concerns, who had been quietly grappling with this issue for some time and not really had a place to go and discuss it and organize and meet kindred spirits in that way. And so it took off really quickly. We went national in 2013, and we've been growing ever since. We're present in about 15 states right now, and we've been instrumental in overturning the death penalty in 2 states over the past 2 years, and also have seen 2 other states implement moratorium during that same time. So we're moving quickly at this point.
In your About Us, which I'll call sort of an internet mission statement, you talk about the alignment of capital punishment with conservative principles and values. There are those who would take umbrage at that, folks who are sort of dyed in the wool, as they consider it to be conservatives, which is all about, in their mind, law enforcement. Talk about the conservative principles and values that you feel don't align with the continued execution of federal and state prisoners.
I think there's some inconsistency in conservative values in more ways than one lately. We're kind of losing what the word means. But traditionally, conservatism was built on a couple of principles. We believe in a limited government. Why? Because we know government is prone to corruption and error and misuse of tax dollars. We believe in fiscal responsibility, fiscal conservatism. We think that we should collect a minimum number of tax dollars, and that those that we do collect should be used towards programs that actually produce the desired outcomes. And lastly, we believe in the sanctity of human life. We are people who say that we believe there are individual rights that the government cannot take from you. And certainly, I think we should include the very right to your life under that. And so, for all of these reasons, the death penalty fails to actually measure up to conservative values. And what we found is that people who want to be consistent in their principles and really live out their views in a holistic way and be effective have recognized that this is a huge hypocrisy that can't continue. And so we are constantly seeing more and more Republicans coming to this awareness, recognizing that this view never vibed with our values, with our principles. It was never something that actually should have been in our realm of support. And we're seeing a lot of Republicans turn against it. We've had 10 states in the past year alone with Republican-sponsored bills to repeal the death penalty. Nearly 60 Republicans were signed on as sponsors to those bills across those 10 states. And then we saw dozens of other Republicans on top of that voting in favor of these bills. And a lot of prominent Republicans coming out and making it publicly known that they are now against the death penalty. So I don't think that we're alone in saying the death penalty fails to measure up to conservatism, but I certainly think that for many decades that was a huge Achilles heel.
Right now, there are, I believe, approximately 60 federal prisoners on what would be considered the federal death row. 60 males, and I believe one woman currently. Was there a formal moratorium against the death penalty for a number of years, or it was just sort of a tacit acknowledgement that there were issues there that needed to be pursued?
There wasn't a federal moratorium, but in keeping with what we've seen across the country, there's been a huge downward trajectory in the usage. We've seen new death sentences plummet by at least 60% nationwide, and we've seen across the states that still have it, which is only 25 that still have active death penalty systems, over a third of them haven't carried out an execution in a decade or more. So the federal government was in keeping with where the states really were on this issue and had not carried out an execution in 17 years until this week. And so many see this as really out of left field and really outside of where the country as a whole is moving on this issue for decades.
Attorney General Barr had retreated, if you will, somewhat ignominiously a few months ago, and I believe it was the last time we spoke, a lifetime away, pre-COVID, if you will, from this. And at the time, what had he cited as his issues from, if you will, resuming, as it seems now temporarily, that moratorium?
Well, he gave a lot of bogus reasons. First and foremost, he said that this was for the victims. We plainly saw that wasn't true. The first execution this week of Danny Lee, the victim's family was adamant in saying that they did not want the death penalty, that they did not feel that this was something that would provide justice or closure, and it was actually something that was exasperating the pain that they had felt. And we saw that the government didn't actually care what they thought one way or another. They were just using them as pawns. And so that was quickly disregarded. They've said this is about law and order, this is about justice, but today in the early morning hours, the second man they executed was a man that was ridden with Alzheimer's. He had no clue where he was when he was being executed. They look ridiculous, frankly. They've been very picky about the cases that they've selected. We know that the leading causes for someone to end up on death row actually have nothing to do with the heinousness of the crime and everything to do with the location where the crime was committed, followed by the socioeconomic status of the defendant and the race of the victim. Those are the leading determinants. But they were sure to pick out defendants who were white, who had crimes that I think would pull on the heartstrings of Americans, and they're very much trying to sweep under the rug all of the other really fatal problems with this system.
Talk about that, if you could elaborate on that choices that they're making, what they're targeting, how they're weaponizing government against, really a specific identity of killer. And why is that so politically profound?
Well, I think that government does a really good job of fear-mongering people, right? That's its first job, is to convince people that they need the government to protect them. And so they've done an excellent job of building up this monster in people's heads. And so the few Americans that are still in support of the death penalty, if you ask them why, they'll say, well, I only support it when we're absolutely sure that the person is guilty, which is totally bogus. We know one person has been exonerated for every 9 executions, and hundreds of others have been released over probable innocence issues. So there's no way we're even coming close to ensuring it's only the guilty that gets the sentence. But secondarily, people will say they support it for the worst of the worst. And they'll typically bring up a Ted Bundy or a Boston Marathon type offender. And they will try to use that to justify their support of it. And I think for many Americans, their perception of who is on death row looks like that, right? Most Americans think that the federal system is resolved for just terrorists or for people who committed treason. Really, there's only one person on the federal death row that's there for either of those crimes. And we've seen terrorists as notorious as some of the people involved with 9/11 not even get the death penalty that are still in max security in Colorado. And so I think that they really play off these perceptions, these misperceptions that Americans have about who gets the death penalty, what it's used for. When you really start digging into the cases, I think most people would be quite surprised to find the nature of the cases that end up there. One person on the federal death row, for example, is there. He killed a man, I believe, during a drug deal and was in Michigan, so he wouldn't have gotten the death penalty because they don't have the death penalty. But because he committed it on federal property, that was able to escalate it and make it a federal death penalty crime. And so had he committed the crime 100 yards away, he probably wouldn't have gotten the death penalty, but because it was on this property, he did. And it's things of that nature that you'll find on death row. And so I think in selecting the cases that they have for this summer, they've tried to go through and pick cases that typically have more sympathetic victims, people, again, defendants who are white, and trying to really sweep under the rug how we're actually assigning this penalty. In reality, across the board, both federal and state systems are decided mostly by the county where the crime is committed. We see only 2% of counties bring the majority of death penalty cases. To date, since reinstatement in 1977, every execution has come from less than 16% of counties. So that's the main determinant in who gets it. If you're in one of these small, high-usage counties, then you have a larger chance of getting it. If you're not in one of those counties, you most likely will not get the death penalty. Followed up by the socioeconomic status of the defendant. Someone who can afford private representation, who can afford a good attorney, is very, very unlikely to end up on death row. And then lastly, we see the race of the victim play a tremendous piece in who gets it. It's almost used entirely for white victims. The number one combination of people you'll find on death row are Black defendants with a white victim in the case. And so it really is marked by bias, by arbitrariness. This is why the Supreme Court overturned it in the early 1970s, is because there was so much evidence of it being used unjustly. And they found that it was cruel and unusual punishment at that time, not because it was cruel, but because it was so random in its application. They said it was as unusual as being struck by lightning and therefore violated the Eighth Amendment. And so they got rid of it. States put all these special protections, the federal government put special protections in place to ensure it was used more justly. But we have over 6 decades worth of data now that shows it's not come close to that at all.
Infamously, Bill Clinton, during his administration, and what we loosely hear the coalition call Operation Change the Subject, bombed an aspirin factory in order to take the emphasis away, if you will, from the then burgeoning sex scandal that was enveloping, if you will, the White House. Is this as some would suggest, a craven attempt by the Trump administration to appeal to their base, continue to project him as the law and order president, and sort of rescue him, if you will, from the precipitous political decline he's experienced during COVID?
Well, the timing certainly helps him. I can't say that this is entirely driven by this. This was something he put into motion last summer when they first announced that they would begin resuming executions for the first time in 16 years at that point. They've had a lot of delays because there's really serious constitutional issues around the usage of the death penalty. We have problems with the drugs that are being used. The manufacturers don't want their products used in this manner. The government continues to try to go behind their backs and use their products anyways, which is clearly a very big ethical issue that all conservatives and libertarians should be concerned about. Huge freedom of association problems there. And so I think they were delayed, but certainly I think they've been rushing to make sure they were carried out this summer because it plays right into the law and order, tough on crime, macho act that we have going on. But I think what they're going to find is that only works for a very small segment of the population. For the most part, over the past decade, people my age, people a little bit older than me, people a little bit younger than me, all of whom are voting age now, have been paying attention to true crime. We've been watching the entertainment factors. We've been able to see behind the curtain of the justice system in ways that previous generations weren't able to. And we're really recognizing how corrupt it is and how it actually operates. And so criminal justice reform is not only popular, it's being demanded. People know that the tough on crime policies were not actually tough on crime. We locked up a lot of people. We ruined a lot of people's lives. We wasted a lot of money, and we didn't actually make our community safer. We didn't put money into programs that actually worked to produce the outcomes we said we wanted. And so I think he's going to fall on his face with this.
We often talk here in Rhode Island about the pipeline to prison. Clearly socioeconomic effects precipitated by poor legal support at the local level engender that, in addition to the criminalization of what had been formerly civil crimes, and then continued criminalization of the drug war, which again precipitates the type of chaos that you see legally entering the judicial system. right now, clearly the nation's eyes are directed towards the pandemic. Do you believe that the federal government, particularly in this case, the Department of Justice, is taking advantage of that to try and build or at least try to assimilate a type of routineness, if you will, if that's even a word, into the execution of human beings?
Well, I certainly think that they're looking for anything they can grab to distract the nation. And I think that, from the era Trump is from, in the 1990s and 2000s when he was in his prime, the death penalty was a hot topic. It really got people's attention, and it kind of created a sense of safety. And again, I just think he's really out of touch with where the nation has moved. But yeah, I think he's putting his chips in that basket and hoping that gets people somehow galvanized to rally behind him. I think he's correctly reading into a sentiment in the country where there is going to be some pushback over some of the protests that we've seen in this country over the summer, and over some of the things like toppling statues. I think there is a segment of the population that has been bothered by that, specifically within space. So I think trying to appear tough on crime is something that he's trying to use to pit himself as the opposite to Democrats. Regardless of what his motivations are, though, I certainly think you can say the administration has little reason to carry these executions out, except for the fact that they're playing politics with people's lives. That not only affects the defendants, but more importantly, again, it affects the families. We work with murder victims' family members across this country, and they're so often used as pawns and have their names drug into these things by politicians who are seeking to make a name for themselves or prove a point politically. When in reality, if you listen to the majority of victims' family members that we work with and hear from, they don't want the death penalty. It's something that actually causes them further harm and trauma and keeps them in a period of having to go in and out of courts. And then as the family faced this week, having to consider traveling to be present for an execution in the middle of COVID, which would expose them, and they didn't feel safe doing that, and the courts didn't care, and the government didn't care, and they did it anyway. So they were just disrespected from start to finish.
Is there any sense, if you will, and it's hard because these cases are so diverse, the jurisdictions are numerous, but we speak to the victims' families. Is there any overall number or estimate of how many years this adds to the victims' families' participation in events that I would imagine clearly they wish to put behind them?
Yeah, I believe the average time from sentence to execution is somewhere between 15 and 20 years. That differs, of course, based on the location, the state, or the federal system in which state the sentence occurs in. But it's certainly a decades-long affair for them that really prevents them from being able to begin to move forward. I don't like the word closure, as I've been told by the majority of those families. That's not really ascertainable, but it prevents them from being able to pick up the pieces and begin to try to move forward. It prevents them from being able to find healing, true forgiveness. And also it wastes a lot of resources that could be better spent on actual services that victims' families need after something like this has occurred, whether that be therapy, temporary childcare if they've lost a spouse. It could be help with paying their bills if they've lost the breadwinner in their family, and things of that nature.
On one hand, of course, you've got situations, I would imagine, where literally family members pass without this quote-unquote ending. And I agree with you. I abhor the term closure. I can't imagine there is anything called closure, particularly for a parent. But to your second point, doesn't the nature of our justice system in its entirety represent the continuation of these type of environments because of its complete politicization? I mean, there's an old saying in Boston, in the halls of justice, justice is in the halls. And that points to, if you will, the peculiar nature of individualized justice. And I'm being sarcastic. Is there any will in the political system at this point to just bring all this madness to an end? I'm not just talking about the final point when crimes are committed that take lives or crimes that are committed that qualify for the death penalty. But if in fact the entire pipeline to prison, is there any recognition at any level how thoroughly failed at every level this system is?
Certainly, I think there's a wide awakening happening across our country right now about these issues. And I think more so than at any other time in my lifetime, and certainly since I've become involved in criminal justice issues, we see a demand for people that are really wanting to see radical change and to see new solutions. And even in the lawmakers that I work with, who I think tend to be a bit more tempered than your average activist or citizen might be about some of these things, there's a hunger. They want to know what comes next. What do we try next? We can all collectively look at the system that we have, look at the past couple of decades worth of data, and recognize that it has been a colossal failure. It's a blight on our country. It'll be a blight on our history. I think it's something that in 100 years, people will look back and say, how did they let this happen? It's an embarrassment. And I think that everybody is sort of waking up to that, except for a few people on the fringe in both parties. But I think when it comes to what do we do, it's such a monstrous thing to try to fix. It's going to take a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of bipartisanship to come together. Fortunately, criminal justice reform seems to be the one thing we're coming together on thus far. We've managed to achieve, some really big things even in the past 4 years under Trump's presidency, even though he's not always lended his voice to being supportive of the efforts. Many within the Republican Party have, and I think there's a real desire for Republicans to lead on this and to really lead in our values and to continue to be the party of individual liberty. So I think that we can see change happen. Certainly, there's been an awakening this year over the racial bias in our system, and I think that's causing a lot of people to become more concerned with the justice system, if they weren't already, really recognizing that the outcomes are so disparate and wanting to make sure that that's something we eradicate. So I'm anxious to move forward. I see tremendous opportunity, and I'm very hopeful.
In a not so subtle irony, the current lion of the Democratic Party, Joe Biden, who many see as this gentle man, elderly man, sort of someone who would position himself as someone who is going to bring peace and reconcile, if you will, the wide swing, the wide division in American politics. Quite frankly, is almost single-handedly responsible for some of the issues that have brought our criminal justice system to where it is. And I'm talking about, obviously, minimum sentencing, third strike, broken glass. I mean, here's someone who was there all along and was very often a vocal supporter of some of the most important provisions, if you will, of criminal justice system that have precipitated exactly what we're dealing with right now: the unrest, the multi-generational, if you will, economic racism, all of that. Does he, from your estimation, does he get a pass on that? Does he get to just come in and sort of fix it?
No, and I think, that's a problem we see across the board, where you have politicians in office for years and years and years and years, and then they claim to have the solutions. Like, well, where were you 10 years ago with these solutions, bud? Of course, no, he does not get a pass in my estimation. And I think there's a lot of people currently in office who don't get a pass, who've been involved and who've been in office all the way through the 90s, where we really saw many of these terrible policies be implemented. And you think they'd be hanging their head in shame, but oftentimes they're not. So I think that comes down to Americans holding people accountable and really demanding to see fresh voices in this and see new approaches. And unfortunately, I think people have a short memory. So while you and I are aware of who drafted some of these bills and who was really involved, I don't know that every American is. And so I think we've seen this in the past, with candidates on gay marriage and other things of that nature, where all of a sudden they're supportive, and they've always been supporters, and that's not the reality. So just as those issues kind of rose in prominence and you saw people change their tune and jump on the bandwagon, that's what's happening with criminal justice reform right now. It's not just popular, it's essential to be pro-criminal justice reform if you want to survive in this environment as a politician. And so you're seeing a lot of people jump on the bandwagons that weren't genuinely there and probably don't really care that much still.
Right, and one only need look to, what seemed early on to be a favorite to be the vice presidential nominee by Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, to understand post-BLM, or I should say post-resurgence of Black Lives Matter, how her fortunes appear to have fallen based, I would imagine, primarily on a terrible record as the district attorney for the 27th district in San Francisco. I mean, she's the two of them almost would be a multi-generational poster child for bad behavior. Do you see the same tea leaves? Is she out of the picture now because of the resurgence of Black Lives Matter and the explosion of racial issues?
Well, I can't really speak on the campaign. I run a nonprofit, so I'm focused on the policy issue, and I don't really care what they do with their ticket. But I think certainly we're seeing repercussions for prosecutors across this country. It used to be something people hung their hat on to run, and that was really, their like next step in the ladder, next rung that they stepped up on. And nowadays it's not working out that way for a lot of people. We're seeing many prosecutors replaced with prosecutors who are reform minded, who are running on reform. And we continue to see those prosecutors, especially those who are involved in death penalty cases, specifically when there was an innocence issue, as there's been in so many, really have to answer for that and finding that it's not the next rung like it used to be. So I'm glad to see that.
Yeah, and one also thinks of Ms. Klobuchar as well, understanding that you're apolitical. The behavior has consequences. Sometimes karma takes 15, 20, 30 years, but the interesting thing about some of these folks who are longtime members of the government is that they have records, and it's up to us on the political class, if you will, to amplify those records. As an activist, I look to you for guidance, if you will. You're someone who is you've been doing this for a couple of years now. You run this campaign, if you will. You're on steroids. I mean, it's astonishing to see, just to follow you as you go literally from town hall to state central powers of government, preaching to this. What type of behavior? Is it time for civil disobedience in situations like this? How should activists conduct themselves, and what are the methodologies to finally putting this to an end that you would suggest?
Well, I think that's an age-old debate, right? You go back to Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. Do you raise hell or do you peacefully protest? And I think both can work in different settings. I am a big believer in one thing. I am not impacted by the justice system. By virtue of being a white woman, by virtue of being middle class, by virtue of having familial connections, I have not been had the interactions with the criminal justice system that many people have in this country, and I know that, and I'm very lucky to be in that position. So I'm not going to tell people who have been impacted by that system, who have had their lives taken, their fortunes taken, who have seen their families killed by the system, the best way for them to protest. I don't think that that's my place. I can't speak to what I would be doing. If I had lost loved ones to the system, you'd probably see me freaking out in the streets as well. For me, for our organization, we find that we have tremendous success just going in and talking with people. This is something that is very well received, and it's something that people are genuinely interested in. They're curious about it. They want to know, what am I missing? Why should conservatives be concerned with the system? And I always say that within an elevator pitch's time, I can usually talk most people, maybe not to be an abolitionist totally, but at least backing off their support for the death penalty, because there's just so many problems with it. I think support for it runs about a mile wide and an inch deep. And if you really just get in front of a person and let them know, like, hey, these are the innocence issues. This is how hard it is to work an innocence case out of the system. This is how it's actually sentenced. This is who we give it to. These are the costs involved. These are the opportunity costs involved. There's not a lot of good arguments for it. And we see that at state legislatures as well. People always ask, who's your opposition? We only really have one form of organized opposition. It's usually the district attorneys' conferences, and they come in and they don't really have a leg to stand on. They're great arguers. That's their job. That's what they've built their careers on. But they don't have a lot of talking points in their corner because the facts are just on our side around this. And so we've seen great results. We're active at state capitals. We're talking to state lawmakers. We are talking to the stakeholders. We're typically working with very large coalitions of murder victims' family members and law enforcement. You'll find a lot of retired members of law enforcement, a lot of retired attorneys general and district attorneys, and others who've actually had to be involved in these processes. People who've worked in corrections are adamantly opposed and get very vocal. And so we work with those populations, and we really try to elevate the stakeholders, people who have been impacted by this system directly, and let them speak for themselves. And what we find is that we win. I think we'll continue to.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me when I meet folks who were part of the system. One thinks of someone like Judge Jim Gray of the Libertarian Movement, who was an early heroic opponent to the drug war, having served as a judge in California, having served in the military and adjudicated cases within the military about drugs post-Vietnam. And to meet someone of that stature who undergoes that type of lifetime conversion, again, these folks are heroic because they're essentially revolting against a culture of death, in this case, that they've been steeped in their entire lives. We would do well to listen to those folks because of their it's not a cliche. It's not a bad Hollywood movie where the guy gets let off at the end. We've seen twice this week where there are numerous attempts to end, if you will, the execution and the torture at the very end, both for victims' families as well as the families of these criminals. I mean, it's horrific, absolutely horrific. You know, there are a number of people, and I'd like to try and start a little bit of a bandwagon within the libertarian movement because I think we need to be shaken up a little bit about current issues. Are you aware of who is up next, and you know what the nature of the case is? Is there, you know, so often this comes to the attention via the media. I mean, your efforts are heroic, but so often this comes to the mass attention when, quite frankly, it's too late. You know, there's an execution scheduled. We're days away, and then all of a sudden the news shows up. Who's up next, and are there cases to be made to oppose these?
Well, there's still 3 more cases that the federal government has scheduled this summer. One of those is supposed to be taking place tomorrow. I don't have my order in a row, but they are public, and you can find out who's up next, specifically around the case. I believe he's supposed to be executed tomorrow evening, but we anticipate that might be delayed given the timing of the past 2 executions this week. So it could end up being moved to Saturday. But they've scheduled a total of 5 for this summer. As far as state level executions, they are mostly on hiatus right now. Most states kind of gone into a de facto moratorium due to COVID. We've only seen, I think, 2 states carry out executions so far, so we're hoping that will continue. But I will say, you know, there's great ways for people to get involved around the cases, but ultimately, the reality is that these things will continue to happen until we get rid of this policy legislatively. And so I think it's important to raise your voice around these executions, but I also think it's really important to raise your voice with your state House and Senate lawmakers and let them know this is something you want off the books, period. You want it into the system. It's not enough to just say one person, you know, on a Hail Mary when they've been scheduled for an execution, which it's really hard to do once an execution has been scheduled. We need to actually end this at the front end. Right.
How can folks support your organization, both philosophically and well, financially?
We're at conservativesconcerned.org. So that's a great place to go and get more information. You can see which states we have current chapters in. You can contact us and let us know if you're wanting to get more active and raise your voice. We love to plug people in different platforms that we have. And then we're also at Conservatives Concerned on Facebook and at our acronym CCATDP on Twitter.
Do you have a message for libertarians? Because quite frankly, I'm frustrated at it. I'll put a weight on it. On one hand, you've got rhetoric. On the second level, you've got actual physical action. You're not political, but at the same token, are you frustrated by what I perceive as inaction from the very community that should be the most vocally opposed to this, that should be hell-bent, if you will, literally, you know, cuff yourself to that state house fence, tie yourself to the White House, you know, figuratively on a political level, set yourself on fire. What do we have to do to wake libertarians up to this?
Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. I was pretty disappointed to see some of the backlash over some of the statements made at this weekend's convention as well. I think you're probably talking about some of the backlash to the anti-racist comments that were made, which I wholeheartedly supported. I think, you know, if you're someone who cares about limited government and individual liberty, you have no excuse to not care about anti-racist work. And for those who say that, you know, this doesn't have to be your issue, you wouldn't say that about war. You wouldn't say that about any other kind of infringement on people's rights. That's a cop-out, and I think it's disgusting. We know that this is an issue that is quite literally killing people at the hands of our government. It's one problem I've had with the libertarian movement is this is something that, as someone who is genuinely principally concerned with limited government individual liberty, we should be at the front lines of this. We should be raising hell. We should be nonstop, consistent, vocal, and I know libertarians can be vocal. I've seen it. Where are you? Where are you on these issues? These things are in line with everything that movement and that party test to believe in. So there should be action following that up, and it should be bold action. I think too often people are satisfied with kind of the low-hanging fruit around criminal justice reform. And while that's needed, we need reentry work, we need workforce development. We also need to really focus on the root causes of these problems. We need to look at what causes violence. We need to look at what causes poverty, which often is linked with violence. We need to figure out how we can intervene early on and actually have programs that produce the outcomes we want, which are safer communities, which are freer individuals, which is more economic liberty for people. So I think that there is an appetite within the libertarian movement for that. I think that there's some people who want to hide behind excuses to not be more active in those regards, and I hope that they're consistently shouted down.
Well, thank you so very much for that. Hannah Cox, she is the national manager for conservatives concerned about the death penalty. They can be found at conservativesconcerned.org, where there is a detailed analysis of costs, civil liberties, legal cases, ongoing executions. You know, it's time to dive past the superficial treatment of this issue. We call it outrage porn here, Anna, by the primary media, and understand the underlying impact, the underlying causes. And the only way you do that in America today is to ignore the mainstream press and go to the source. I so often talk about websites that have been developed by not-for-profit, apolitical, cause-related think tanks, for lack of a better term, and they are at this point in every way superior in analyzing and reporting on this particular issue than anything in the media at large. So I would commend to everyone's attention, again, conservativesconcerned.org, because a thorough reading of that, as opposed to engaging, if you're a libertarian, in back and forth analysis of Mises, or any one of the economists, I'm not just picking on Mises, is probably going to be more salient and more directly impactful in today's American climate. It's time for libertarians to get real. It's time for Americans to understand these causes as well. So thank you, as always, for joining us. Usually we catch up with you in the midst of these heated battles, and you're very gracious for spending some time with us this afternoon.
Thanks so much. I enjoyed it, Pat.
All right, we'll talk again soon. Again, Hannah Cox, she is the national manager for conservatives concerned about the death penalty. 2, now about to be 3 executions by your federal government, utilizing your taxpayer money, hijacking your personal philosophies, reinforcing failed notions about political boogeyman, all in order to secure their political futures. Folks, we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Radio Network. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, and of course, CoalitionRadioNetwork.com or CoalitionRadio.us, our 2 sites. We'll be back shortly. There's more programming tonight.